Good afternoon. You can hear me okay. Really glad we pulled you all back from lunch and the networking session, and congratulations to the team at Natural for this amazing conference. I've presented many times on this topic. The good news is that I actually have to keep changing my presentation because this market is moving really quickly, and I'm going to talk about how the market is now moving and what is actually happening. If the slides work. Now, of all the presentations I've given, this is probably the most comfortable set of seats that I've given it in. It feels like we're in a sort of view cinema, seeing the matinee of the afternoon. But whilst your seats are very comfortable, we shouldn't be comfortable because the pace and scale of natural degradation, as we all know, is terrible by numbers, but unsustainable for the planet, for society, and certainly for economies. But I guess what makes me really worried is not just the pace of degradation, is the fact that our financial system and the securities and the companies that it invests trillions of dollars in is wired to keep going on that destruction at the moment. And that's because for the last 160 years, the capital markets have priced natural assets and the services that we depend on at zero. I'm a huge believer in financial markets. I've worked in them for 30 years. I think they do immense good for society, for jobs, for economies. They encourage investment and innovation, but they only work well when risk is priced properly. And at the moment, they are not pricing in risk of the degradation of the natural assets that they are causing, and we have to fix that. But the good news is this is changing. The good news is that people are moving from awareness to assessment to an integrated approach to looking at not just climate but nature and starting the journey to fix this. And as someone said early, it may sometimes feel like fun, but it's certainly a lot of opportunity and innovation that is there for financial markets and investment. So my job today is to share with you and illustrate what's happening in the marketplace, how are leaders integrating natural capital into their decision making and their portfolio allocation, and how can we break some of the myths and the excuses for inaction? I think I'm talking to the converted today. If there are skeptics in the room, that's fantastic, because I like talking to skeptics too. But our job is to actually convince people that we've got to stop saying things like nature is too complicated, or there isn't enough data, as we've heard this morning. We need to break that down. We need to do what financial markets are very good at, breaking down complexity, making it managing and harnessing data to do good. We've seen these slides many times before. It illustrates what Partha Dasgupta said in his brilliant review, which is our economic system and our natural system are integrated, particularly when scarcity becomes relevant and things start moving from abundant to scarce, and we realize that we're exhausting the natural system faster than our economies can support them. The interesting thing about the conservation cost, that nearly $1 trillion, is that's actually a fraction of the investment estimated to decarbonize the energy system. So actually isn't a huge amount of money that needs to be deployed to preserve natural systems. But the problem is we're only really at the start of the journey of this. We're only just really starting as people in the financial markets and companies to listen to the scientists and what they've frankly been telling us for many years, that we have to start acting on this change. You can read the newspaper headlines. You can think back to the droughts in last summer. I saw the headlines this morning on Italy. Italy is now saying they're going to get another drought. The winter has been incredibly dry. The impact onto their food system, their rivers, their natural systems is immense. And it's just one example around the world of where this is making headlines around there. There are many, many case examples. The Californian almond industry, I could put many up there. But I think what's interesting is if you think about your own portfolios or your companies, your investors, is find me an investment portfolio that does not rely on plastic, does not rely on pesticide, on fertilizer, on meats, on water, on deforestation. It's actually very hard. I've asked this question of investors many times. How much plastic is in your investment portfolio? And most don't know. But one scary data point for this country is that we all, on average, produce 100 kilograms of plastic waste each every year. So one of my asks to think about is just go home and look at what you're consuming. Because if you as consumers can change, you'll remove one of those excuses that companies sometimes have, which is there isn't demand to save the planet. But we as consumers can actually do a lot to encourage innovation and demand around there. And nature is our largest asset for fighting climate change. What integrators and leaders are doing is they're realizing that if I want to address climate change, I need to do that together with nature. This was from the IPCC report. It's the kind of dirty little secret of the report that came out last April, which was the largest impact to reduction of CO2 equivalent and greenhouse gas emissions was how we change the use of land, forestation, water, soil. In fact, the largest contributor of their estimated reduction was from what they funnily called a FOLU. No one had really heard of that term, but basically how we're using the land and the seas and the food systems and nature. In fact, so large, more than 13 times the impact of electrifying all of the world's vehicle systems. So I love electric cars, and I think we should do a lot more about the electric charging grid and network everywhere, but what you realize is actually we should do a lot more about deforestation and land use and food and consumption and water as well. So nature is our biggest asset to fighting climate change, and yet climate change is destroying nature. So we're in this vicious circle, and we really need to deal with these problems together. Over 2.5 years ago, when I started on this journey with TNFD, a lot of financial institutions said to me, "It's great, David, you're doing this, and we'll get round to nature when we fix climate." We'll get round to nature when we fix climate. No one's saying that anymore. They're realizing that we have to do these two together. And actually, they're realizing that when they assess nature risk, which many in our pilot groups are doing, they're finding that it's more immediate and more severe and more local than climate change risk. And that's an interesting finding that we're getting from the work of the TNFD. So where is the market moving, and where is it going on this? I will confess this is not a scientifically based chart. I'd love to have surveyed the world's financial institutions, the regulators, the companies, and everyone around the world and said, where exactly are you on this scale? So this is my intuitive feel, having spent now 2.5 years every day talking to people about what's happening. And I think what you're seeing is a couple of things. One is that many companies, this is actually not new. One of our strongest pilot groups is the mineral extraction group, and they've been doing environmental assessment for many years, and they would say, actually, this is not new to us. But for some companies, this is completely new, and they haven't really understood the ecosystem services that they depend upon, the impacts that they're having, how impacts turn into dependencies and risks, and these other areas. But for financial institutions, for all but a few, and we had people like AXA on the panel earlier, this is very new. But what's really encouraging and happening fast is the financial system is changing quickly. It's actually changing more quickly than the corporates. And what's going to happen, and I'm seeing it, I had conversations yesterday, is financial investors are now asking and demanding of their companies that they're investing in, what are you doing about biodiversity? Where are your ecosystem services risks? What are your impacts that you're worried about? This conversation is starting to happen, and leaders are realizing that they need to get ahead of it. So as someone said on the panel earlier, you need to start doing this now. Couple of examples. Esun Financial Institution from Taiwan recognized that there was a huge overlap between parts of their investment portfolio affected by climate and, lo and behold, with nature. AXA, who were talking earlier today, affirmed, and they've been doing reporting now for several years on the early start of TNFD and TCFD, that climate and nature were closely integrated in how they see the solutions. Mark Versey, the CEO of Aviva, has written to everyone to say, we need to start thinking about nature and biodiversity risk, and we'd like you to start using the TNFD and using that as a standard around the world to understand the assessment of those risks. And it's not just about risk, of course, it's about opportunity. And as I said earlier, we as consumers can also create opportunity. If you look at the market for what we all love the term nature positive, but we would admit it's not very well defined at the moment, but things like vertical farming, alternative meats and proteins, or plant-based products, plant-based textiles like Tetra Pak has done, or sustainable packaging, biofuels and others, you see something that is probably going to get to $1 trillion quite quickly. And investors and asset managers are starting to realize that there's investment opportunity in investing in these new technologies and these methods and these techniques, some of which have been known for years, like regenerative farming, but just haven't been scaled. And this is where governments and policy can also play a leading role, as well as consumers, to create demand and stimulate the kind of change that we need. Because we haven't really started on that transition journey yet. Whilst people are aware of the risks that they have, they're starting to quantify them and think about them, the transition journey to how to remove plastic from my value chain or how to recycle it all is not there yet. Governments and policymakers, the G7 as mentioned earlier today has endorsed the TNFD. We report back to the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. HM Treasury has also indicated that they would support people adopting the TNFD when it comes out. You heard from John Glenn this morning. The Swiss, several other governments, the French government, are all now demanding more assessment and more disclosure. And this will only continue, and it'll come in various forms. And it's not now to a point where companies can say, well, I'll just wait till the regulations come, because when they come, they'll find that the journey to get there is too quick and too steep to climb. So they have to start investing in the talent and the data sets now. And of course, for many of us who are in Montreal, the breakthrough there was not just the agreement after 3 or 4 years of delay and finally having the conference. The real change and the breakthrough there was the voice of finance and business in the room. Hundreds of organizations were present at Montreal. Hundreds of organizations were signing up to the demand to make it mandatory for disclosures and really were influencing the impact of the GBF. And I think it was said earlier that between the GBF, the Science Based Targets Network, and TNFD, you really do have a full circle of how do I think about the target setting that I need to do. What happens now is each country has to convert these into NBSAPs, these National Biodiversity Strategy Plans, and implement them in local law and policy. And that is a process that is happening now. So again, when people say, well, I don't know the targets for nature, I don't understand where to focus on, well, really, it's kind of becoming an excuse. Yes, it's not perfect, and there's no perfect single number for nature, but there's a lot in the GBF and there's a lot in the science-based target networks that tells you the direction that you need to start heading in. NGFS, which is the group of over 100 central banks, have already started looking at nature-related risks, nature scenarios. One of the first banks in the world to do this was Brazil. The French bank has done this. The Dutch bank has done this. And they're all finding very similar outcomes, that 50% of the banking portfolio of the countries that they're governing has got high or medium exposure to nature-related risk. So this is becoming strategically important for economies. And if you're in the central bank or an economist in Italy right now reading the information about the flood, the drought, you are probably worrying about the economic impact that's having. If you're looking at food inflation, which yes has been caused by the war in Ukraine, but was happening already because of failed harvests, this is a real issue now. It is not something that is 10 years away that we can think about and that's coming. We do really need to act. And standards and regulators are also acting as well. And there are many examples around the world of where nature and biodiversity is now being demanded from regulators. The ISSB has now announced at Montreal that they will start looking not just at climate, but nature and biodiversity and consider the input of the TNFD. And I think that is, for those who criticize quite rightly the alphabet soup of standards, I think this is great news because it means we can rely on something that is more global, more uniform, and easier to implement as well. So the question is not if, but how do leaders integrate into this? And 4 things I think that leaders are starting to do, and this is from my own observation what's happening in the market. They're building natural capital into their core risk and investment strategies with climate. I'll talk a little bit about that. They're adopting a science-based definition for that nature, business, finance interface. Language is important, definitions are important. How do I bring the science into my business model? They're assessing their priority locations. Unlike climate, largely, with nature and biodiversity, location really matters. It's very contextualized with where you're operating or where your supply chain is. And they're investing in talent now. And they're investing in training now. Because what we've realized through the TCFG and the climate journey is we didn't put enough work into a number of things. But we didn't put enough work into training the boards, to training people, to getting talent. So my advice to companies and investors now is don't wait for the war on talent in biodiversity and nature. I'd get ahead of that and start investing in that and start investing in the data and the networks. So building natural capital into core strategies. The old way was through the CSR program, that nature was seen as a reputation risk. If I had a big chemical leak, or my train crashed full of nasty chemicals like it did last week. This is a reputation issue, and I need my CSR team to really be on top of this. The new way is to integrate nature and business into our core strategies. Now, there's a lot of discussion, and I had one at lunch about the academic research and the approach of putting a value on natural assets. It's very hard. I would argue we need to be more pragmatic, because it's almost impossible to have the same precise value for nature. But what you can look at is, where are my dependencies on ecosystem services? Where do I need pollination in my value chain or my investors? Where am I having impacts like pollutions or excess use of fertilizers or plastics? And how do those two things together create risks and opportunities? Then how do I map that into my business value and my flows? So again, a pragmatic approach. It's scientifically informed, but it doesn't have to have a level of precision. And this is what we're learning from the leaders, is that they're incredibly pragmatic about looking at dependencies and impacts and risks. And there are a lot of tools that are only getting better to help them. They're also combining net zero with nature positive. As you saw from my slide earlier, that 34% of greenhouse gas emission reduction is impossible. It's impossible to achieve where we're going to get without harnessing nature. So it is somewhat strange to think about nature and climate separately. In fact, most of our leading organizations are combining the teams. They're looking at TCFD and TNFD reporting together. And they're thinking and ensuring that their net zero strategy is certainly not nature negative, but is also nature positive, and also what are the areas where we can invest in nature positive to help net zero. The nature risk is now. It's not something a long way away. As I said, the momentum is building quickly. Nature is our ally to do that. And people are thinking of investing in nature-like infrastructure. We have a call with the development banks coming up. We love concrete. When we think of a problem in the world and an issue like a flood, we pour concrete. We build structures. We build roofs that wash off rainwater. We have to think about harnessing mangroves, natural systems, green roofs, plant-based approaches to things, rather than always investing in concrete and infrastructure that's physical, because we're just damaging the environment when we do that. And yes, data and metrics are a challenge. Financial markets are amazing places because they're full of incredibly bright people, but sometimes they can be very lazy. And they sort of think that this dashboard's going to pop up and it tells me what my nature score is based on some perfect data set that's out there. It's not going to happen like that. Unfortunately, you do have to roll up your sleeves and actually understand what data is there and the context behind that data, but there's lots of it available. We are literally imaging every square kilometre of this Earth from low Earth satellites every day. So the idea that there's not enough data is becoming a bit of a myth and maybe an excuse. Certainly it's not joined up enough, there are certain gaps in it, but it's evolving so quickly, and it's really exciting to see the data market that is actually there. Number two, adopting the standard science-based definition. Emily touched on this. We use 4 realms of nature: atmosphere, including climate, but also pollutants, land, fresh water, and oceans. Your stocks, which are your environment assets, which create or have value. Your flows, which are ecosystem services, and then the value of diversification and biodiversity. So again, a language that we can use. How does this manifest itself? I call this the periodic table. My son loves this picture. He, a few years ago, said, "Dad, what are you doing about nature?" And I gave him this as a present and said, "Here's what I'm doing about nature." He said, "Oh, you've reinvented the periodic table." Well, we have some very bright people in the team, but I don't think we've done that. But what we have done, and we published this almost a year ago now, been really well received, has taken a huge amount of scientific knowledge, not recreated it, and created a standard way where business and finance can talk about the business interface with nature, so that we all use the same language. We have 4 realms: the land, freshwater, ocean. We have a set of biomes that describe the location and its characteristics. And then we have environmental assets, ecosystem services, and regulating services. And then you can map your business onto this. So when people say it's too complicated, I just show them this picture and say, break it down. Because actually what you find as a business is only 3 or 4 of these areas are really relevant to you, and it's about picking those areas and deciding where the hotspots are. So if you want to print this and put this on the wall, you're very welcome to. It's on our website of how to do it. Assessing locations. We took the best practice from organizations and create something called LEAP: locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. And location is the real key one here. How do I really understand where I'm operating my business, where my supply chain is, both upstream and downstream, and what are the sensitivity areas that I need to care about. And this is new for many companies. For the mining extraction firms, they know where they operate. They know where they're building their mines. For some companies, though, their supply chain is a little bit more opaque. They don't quite understand where it is, and this is new for them. So building that data set of where is their supply chain, where are they operating, and where are their locations is something that they're investing time and effort to do in. It took one company that we're working with about 3 years to do that, just to understand why starting the journey now is so important. And then, of course, you assess not just dependencies, but impacts. And we use the IPBS 5 drives of change. You're all very familiar with this. But importantly, what we've recognized when it comes to business is, yes, you may have impact on resource use, but you also might have a positive effect on resource use. You might actually be doing a positive back into the environment as well. And so we should think about both the nature-related impacts, but also the nature opportunities that we can have from our businesses. Finally, investing in capabilities. I focused here on data. As said earlier, we have over 200 companies in our data catalyst. I could have crowded this slide with hundreds of wonderful icons of new innovators. But what's interesting to me on this is it's combined with different types of companies. Some companies have been around for 20 or 30 years doing this. It's not like they're brand new. And some companies were created in a garage, in Oxford, looking at, say, soil carbon a few months ago. There's a tremendous innovation happening, and I just encourage people to start investing the time in looking at these companies and understanding what's there. So I will finish there. Emily mentioned that our final release of the beta is in March. We have a final release in September. I guess my main message is, if I'd have had this conversation 2 years ago, it would have been very different. It would have been people in the room saying, how can we think about nature? It's too complicated. And by the way, I'm so focused on climate. We'll worry about the planet when climate's fixed. That's clearly changed. And people are recognizing that an integrated approach to climate and nature is the right way to solve this problem, and probably the only way to solve it. There are leaders in this space. They're quite early adopters of this. We have over 200 pilots of companies actually learning and using the TNFD approach. And the question is, well, what can you do next? How can I get involved? Well, certainly, as was said earlier, sign up to the online forum, give us the feedback on this open platform. You've got about, I think, 35 days before the beta release and about 150 days before the final release. So don't hang around. We are moving quickly because we have to get to those 2030 goals. And think about the skeptics that you're going to talk to afterwards. Oh, this is too complicated. There's not enough data. There isn't one standard. Because I think we need to blow those myths apart and start moving to rewire the financial system so it does put a real price on nature. Thank you very much.